Ladies and gentlemen,
we had a leak in the roof, and we've got some men here to repair the leak in the roof. It's been raining like cats and dogs here.
well, it's all good fun. I'm sure it's a voluntary transaction. And on that basis,
it's a demonstration of how we're better off by not having a rain pouring through our roof.
I will go ahead and introduce Professor Fun, Ken Schoolland of Hawaii Pacific University, a very dear friend who always has something interesting and entertaining to share with us. And take it away, Ken.
Thank you very much, Lobo. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to be a part of your show. As a matter of fact, I was so impressed with the previous talks by you yourself and by Tom that I'm going to carry on with some of the ideas that were presented before. Let me go to my show here. I know that people get sometimes bored with slides, but I will do my best to make them entertaining. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. I'm president of the International Society for Individual Liberty. We've done a lot of things. For the last 30 years, we've had world conferences where we draw people in to network about the world of liberty, and we've made contacts in many countries across the world. Most recently, my wife has organized through the Foolish Things events the conference, the World Conference on Market Liberalization in Bali that we had very successfully for 150 people just this summer. She's had 2 previous Shanghai Austrian economic summits bringing together people from around Asia to discuss and explore Austrian economics. Also, we do summer activities with student groups, seminars from Lithuania to Republic of Georgia and to China. A lot of things that we're doing. So we hope that people will feel free to join us. Also, part of our activity has been publications. My book, The Adventures of Jonathan Gullible, has been introducing free market ideas in 80 publications in 50 languages, 4 audiobooks, 4 plays, touring Africa, Eastern Europe, and Kazakhstan, and a Braille edition. These editions have been useful in schools and around universities in introducing a lot of free market ideas. And also throughout a lot of countries where normally free market ideas don't penetrate. I'm especially grateful to the people in Noua El Hormouzi in Morocco and Khalil Hamad, who's been producing many editions of the Jonathan Gullible throughout the Middle East. We're on track to make a movie, an animated film, which I think many of you will hopefully see in the near future. The Hollywood animators of Matthew Parker and Keith Baxter have just recently received some very substantial investment for a full-length feature film on this topic. Now to our topic today. Lobo has kindly invited me to talk about the ethical and practical economic good that entrepreneurs create in the world. Now, it's no surprise that people are eager for prosperity. I mean, they see what the world is like in a sharp contrast between, let's say, North Korea and South Korea. The same culture and population group under 2 completely different systems. One of a free market economy, at least generally free, and one that is absolute tyranny. At our conferences, we've had Yeonmi Park and Shin Dong-yuk, 2 escapees from North Korea. One, Shin Dong-yuk, was actually born in a prison camp in North Korea and lived his whole life there until he escaped. And of course, the march to freedom is something that everyone tries to do around the world because they're fleeing the poverty, the oppression, and the uniformity, seeking the opportunities for free expression and wealth that free societies have. Now, to start off talking about ethics and ethical behavior, as Lobo did in his talk earlier, everybody, almost everywhere in the world, can recognize that voluntary and honest behavior is ethical. And it's not good to lie, to steal, and to kill. I mean, everybody says for any individual to lie, to steal, and to kill, it's bad behavior. You get prosecuted for fraud, for theft, and for murder. Unless You're a politician and you do it on a very, very grand scale, in which case it seems to be applauded by the very same people who would condemn it if it was done by an individual. So whenever I go traveling around the world, I ask people, well, who are these politicians? Are they, generally speaking, do you trust the campaign promises of politicians? I ask the same audiences around the world, generally speaking, is an honest politician more likely to win an election than a dishonest politician? Now, these are countries all around the world. Sometimes they don't have much of a democracy, but sometimes they've got a lot of democracy. But still, regardless of where you go, you get sort of the same kind of response. Generally speaking, are the moral standards of politicians higher than your own moral standards? And always, 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 I get an overwhelming response of no. They don't trust their campaign promises. The dishonest politician is more likely to win, and the moral standards of those politicians aren't any higher than my own. Well, you know, this is borne out in surveys. When you look at the surveys of Americans, for example, what do you think of the honesty and ethical standards of people in different professions? And typically the politicians rank very low. In the United States, they ranked just slightly above prostitutes and car salesmen. And actually, I think that does a disservice to prostitutes and car salesmen, because they don't use force in their business, but politicians, their whole life is dependent on the use of force. And then I ask questions about the government in general. Generally speaking, do you trust that the government will do good and necessary things for the country? And overwhelmingly, I get a response from people, well, yes, of course. And there's this intellectual disconnect between what they think of the people who make up government and then what government itself is. Government in itself has sort of become a god to people. It's become omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. It's a god in their mind that should be doing the good things for them. And they don't think about the politicians that make it up. Well, a lot of this, I think, is rooted in popular myths. We have a popular myth in Hawaii. I come from Hawaii. I'm here right now, and we have a king who's rather famous. He has a big statue out in front of the Iolani Palace of King Kamehameha the Great, and we have a parade to celebrate Kamehameha Day, and children are brought out to praise this King Kamehameha. Well, what is it about him that made him great? Actually, he just killed more people than any of his rivals. By treachery, he invited his brother to come for a parley to discover who was how they were going to rule the Big Island. And as his brother was coming off his boat, King Kamehameha's, the chief Kamehameha at the time, right-hand man went up behind him and stabbed him in the back. And then after that, it was just a matter of conquest, as it so often has been throughout the world. The idea that you won by victory in battle. Now, a couple weeks later in the United States, right after we celebrate Kamehameha Day, we also celebrate Independence Day. You know, the celebration of America's breaking away from the forced union with the British colonies. I mean, we were under King George III, and our George Washington was victorious in battle at separation from King George III in England. And so we have celebrations just a couple weeks apart for almost opposite things. One is for forced union, and the other one is for independence. So which are we celebrating? Which is the noble thing? It isn't the action that people are celebrating. They're celebrating victory in battle, much as you could say as the contradiction on President's Day. You know, we celebrate the birthday of two presidents who were born on birthdays fairly close together, and then all the presidents, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, really being celebrated for opposite purposes, one for forced union and the other for independence. And we have lots of presidents throughout American history who have championed one kind of purpose, and such as secession, and another kind of purpose of forced union. Well, all we're doing is celebrating heroic victories of leaders. And I would say that it comes back to a purification ritual we allow people to change their behavior, their ethics, depending on some kinds of rituals that are performed to sanction lying and stealing and killing. Now, historically, way back in human time, the purification ritual may have been, well, looking at the stars and what were the astrologers saying about the stars and who mandated who should have the right to rule, or tea leaves, or chicken bones, tarot cards, hand palms, head bumps, all kinds of justifications. But the most of recent history in the world, throughout the world, has been dominated by the notion of the divine right of kings, because kings were said to be granted the authority to steal, to lie, to kill by God, if it was serving the purpose of God. And that was, of course, kings wanted to have their witch doctor to justify what they were doing. And we still have monarchs today that have their basis of action on those kinds of ancient notions of the divine right of kings. Throughout Scandinavia, most of the Scandinavian countries have monarchs. England has a monarch, Belgium and Holland, Spain, Thailand, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Tonga, Malaysia, a lot of countries, Saudi Arabia, a lot of countries still have monarchs. Now they're constrained, you could say, by, to a great extent, by constitutional constraints, but that's simply a new kind of divine right, what I call the divine right of majorities, where a large number of people justifying action of a ruler by the raising of hands allows rulers to lie, to steal, and to kill with impunity. And there have always been those who championed this right of majorities and others who challenge it. Now, the decision spectrum over the years has, on the one hand, given absolute power and rule to the use of force and fraud by rulers over individuals, and on the other end, where they don't accept that notion, where individuals have the right to rule themselves. So against the notion of divine right of kings and the divine right of majorities stood out people who were saying that voluntary action by individuals was superior to the forceful actions of rulers. Paramount in history have been like Lao Tzu in China, Juan de Mariana, Henry David Thoreau, Thomas Paine, Adam Smith, John Locke, were ones who championed the notion of individuality against the rulers. And today we see it in what I call the economic spectrum, a range of decision-making over people's economic lives, from the pure command economy of the communist school of thought, where all decisions are made by the dictatorship of the proletariat, the intellectual elite who are supposed to command and control all the resources of the society. The Keynesians who accept individual action in the market, but only to the extent that it can't, that it is manipulated by government spending, taxation, and regulation. And I consider the monetarist school as allowing a little bit more individual action, but they indirectly control the economy through their money printing and their interest rates and bank regulations and so on. But at the far end, the market economy champions are those of the Austrian school of economic thought, the followers of Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Murray Rothbard, people who have been championing the right of individuals to make their own choices. To the extent that government exists at all, it may exist only for the purposes of protection of police, courts, and defense. But there are others who say that even those things, as valuable as they are, can be provided more successfully and with greater efficiency with freedom of choice and freedom of action in the marketplace. So these are the ranges in the economic spectrum as people try to find out what is the best way to bring about the prosperity that everybody wants. Now, people want the prosperous life, especially when they're living in hovels and they feel destitute and hopeless. and people have been constantly trying to move from the places that are desperately poor to the places that are prosperous. But not as much thought is given to what makes the prosperity. Usually the question that people ask is, why is there poverty? But that's not the real question. Poverty is the natural state of things. All countries have come from a long, long history of poverty, and many countries are still in those desperate conditions of poverty. The real question to ask is, why is there prosperity? Because it's in the last 150 to 200 years that some nations have taken off and soared with extraordinary prosperity and wealth for their population, where in other countries they didn't. So if you really want to know how to make a difference, then find out what it is that those countries have been doing differently. The people who I champion the most when looking at the analysis of these things is the Fraser Institute with their Economic Freedom of the World Index. Now they rank countries, just their political demarcations on the map that set out how people are doing things differently in the great world laboratory of different kinds of experiments of economic and political systems. And they look at 5 criteria. Number one, the size of government, spending and taxation. How much is the government taking from people? And that discourages people from producing wealth. What are the legal rights? If you have contracts, agreements, property, does the government recognize those things, or do they just allow people to take it away from you so that there's no incentive to produce? Is there sound money, so the money that you earn and you put into savings or that you're holding keeps its value, or does it lose its value as time goes by inflation and price and purchasing power decline? And free trade, how free are you to trade across borders with other countries, thus benefiting by the skills, the talents, and resources of other people, or are you limited to your neighborhood by government regulations and regulations on other things domestically about labor and business and so on? Well, they've ranked all the countries of the world by this Economic Freedom of the World Index, and I find that when I travel around to various places in China and India, that these things tremendously impact the way people live. Take, for example, property rights in India. For the most part, vast stretches of the landscape have been nationalized by the government, decades ago by the British first and then the Indian government, and the farmers were left in squalor. But recently, the right to property movement, using these Google Maps and GPS devices to prove where they've been farming the land, have now established, for $1 per farm, have been able to establish title to their land. And that has transformed their lives because they are now able to produce livestock and crops and a great deal of prosperity that never existed before. Their incomes have soared and they're able to send their children to school and earn professions, things that have kept them down for years. And other countries, the terrible consequences of government taking of property and just crushing the people who stood in the way of trying to keep their farms and prevent it from cronies of the officials getting the land from them, has been a tragic story around the world. But it makes a difference to have property rights. In addition, the Fraser Institute's analysis of trade barriers speaks to what people in a lot of countries face when they have trade barriers. In the United States, we have had trade barriers, and we've paid as much as 4 times as much as the world market price. We've been denied being able to buy our sugar from around the world. We've even paid farmers to destroy their sugar in order to keep farm prices high. Well, this is beneficial to special interest groups, but at great cost to the country. We've seen in the United States the purchasing power of the dollar decline. I mean, it hasn't declined as much as in most other countries of the world, but it's declined very dramatically nonetheless, and that's been a huge harm to the savers and the workers, people who are earning money and expecting their income to be keeping its value. And just recently, we've seen huge increases in the quantity of money printed to solve economic recessions and to bail out banks, and I'd say we're in trouble, heading into more serious trouble in the years to come. Inflation has a redistributive effect which robs from people on fixed incomes, savers, pensioners, people who are ultimately the creditors loaning their money to other people today, expected to be paid back in the future, and inflation damages the return that they're expecting. And people have to pay higher taxes just because earning more income to keep up with the cost of living puts them in higher tax brackets. And the biggest winners during times of inflation are the debtors that get to pay back in cheaper money, the owners of land and gold that are holding a quantity of product that is tremendously in demand during times of inflation, foreign currencies that may be of greater value than your own currency, museum collectors, all the things that the government does in printing money and spending it first before the prices go up. It is the biggest beneficiary in all the categories of winning. That's why governments throughout the world tolerate inflation, and they make it illegal to use alternative currencies because of their legal tender laws. So that's another problem. Now, if you look back at the Economic Freedom of the World Index, the countries that are the highest on the ranking there are the ones that have overwhelmingly the most amount of wealth per capita. And also important is not only the amount of wealth they have, but the growth that they're expecting. In many of the poorest countries of the world, the ones with the greatest control over government, the growth and so on, of the wealth that people have, they have even declining amount of wealth per capita. Now, a good example that I like to point to is the growth that existed in between 1950 and the year 2000. Growth was significantly the difference between what was happening in Latin American countries and what was happening in the Asian tigers. If you were trying to think of a place to live in 1950 that would hold the greatest prospect for future wealth for your children and your grandchildren, you might have picked out Latin American countries because they had a lot of oil wealth, they had a lot of resources, they were wealthier than those Asian tigers. Why shouldn't they be the places where they had the greatest amount of growth? But it turns out that they had very, very little change in the amount of wealth per person over 50 years. But look at the Asian tigers. And they went from being some of the poorest countries in the world to being among the richest, even richer than their former British rulers in the case of Hong Kong and Singapore, with 20, 35, and 40 times more wealth per person than 50 years before. So growth really matters, and what mattered was that those Asian tigers always ranked very high on the Economic Freedom of the World Index. It's not a measure of political freedom. Hong Kong and Singapore don't elect don't have a free and unrestrained democracy, but they have a lot of economic freedom, and this has occurred for beneficial for Korea as well as Japan and so on, and Taiwan. But the Latin American countries, there have been some who have recently come up the ranking here. Peru and Costa Rica rank pretty good today compared to what they used to be. But most of the Latin American countries rank very, very low on the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and the people of those countries by the millions suffer as a consequence. Now, one country that has soared in recent years has been New Zealand. They were the slowest growing economy of the industrial world after World War II for about 25 years. And then in 1984, the Labour Party, the socialists of New Zealand, made the most radical free market economic reforms, and they became the fastest growing economy of the industrial world. They cut their government in half by selling off state-operated enterprises. They stabilized their currency values, they opened up trade, and they ended subsidies for their farmers, the highest subsidies in the world to almost none within 3 months. And they soared, and it was picked up by the National Party later on to further economic reforms, and they did very, very well. Now, what happens in this is that when countries are growing, it is the poorest of those countries that benefit the most. That's why I consider this not only a practical thing to produce wealth, but it has very humanitarian consequences. It produces an enormous amount of wealth that benefits the poor as well. Even if there's a divide between a gap between what the rich have and what the poor have, the poor are much better off in a country that's growing. We also see that life expectancy is longer, literacy is higher. political rights and civil liberties are much better respected in those countries that are ranked high on the Economic Freedom of the World Index, because people are richer and more able, therefore they are empowered to challenge authorities and their policies. There's less corruption in the countries that have more economic freedom, because where there's more economic freedom, there are fewer opportunities for the governments to sell favors to their friends and to punish their enemies. Also, there's a better economic environmental performance in countries that are prosperous and wealthy. They can expend a great deal more on environmental concerns. Now, China has been going up. The Economic Freedom of the World Index, actually, before the Economic Freedom of the World Index was devised, it was improving, and it hasn't been improving over the years as a whole, but it still ranks pretty low. Everybody knows that China has been the engine of growth for millions, hundreds of millions of people in the last couple decades, lifting more people out of poverty than ever before in history. As Tom Palmer mentioned in his previous talk just an hour ago, this has been an astounding success story, both for India and for China, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and yet they still rank pretty low on the Economic Freedom of the World Index. So how can this really be explained then? Well, it's explained because China is such a huge country that every province is larger than most countries of the world. And when you break down the economic freedom of the world performance of different provinces of China, you find a vast difference, that some of the provinces of China are considered to be even freer than Hong Kong and Singapore on the Economic Freedom World Index, and other provinces are off the bottom of the chart. And so what I consider the sixth factor that the Fraser Institute does not take into account, but I consider an even more important factor than all of the others, is the migration, the allowance of people to go from the very poor and controlled areas to the very rich and free areas is a very, very important way to allow for entrepreneurial activity and to allow the labor of human beings to be greatly magnitude in what it's able to bring to people. China has seen some fishing villages like Shenzhen as a special economic zone become like Hong Kong with its in just a couple of decades. And Hong Kong itself grew because of the tremendous openness to migration from around the world, across Asia in particular, people who were desperate to leave the controls and poverty and of China and Vietnam and other countries around Asia. It was a mecca for a lot of them to come and to be free to produce their wealth that they couldn't produce anywhere else. Stuart Anderson, Executive Director of the National Foundation for American Policy, says that immigrant entrepreneurs are the heroes of a market-based economy, driving innovation and job creation. They started 33% of U.S. venture-backed public companies in the United States between 2006 and 2012. Now, these are a lot of very familiar names to us. We know of Google, Intel, eBay, Facebook. I mean, a lot of these companies have been founded by immigrants who wouldn't have had the opportunities had they not moved. And I champion the work of Francisco Ortega and Giovanni Peri, who say that openness to knowledge, skills, and ideas from the rest of the world may be one of the most important engines of economic growth and technological advancement for a country. In fact, they hold up the openness to migration as a more important factor in economic development than trade. And trade is usually highlighted as the hallmark of economic growth in most policy studies and international research and so on. But I would say that immigration is even more important to economic growth. Now, there's a guy, Adrian Furman, who asks the question, well, why do foreigners make better entrepreneurs? He notes that first-generation migrants started businesses at twice the rate of Native Americans and of second-generation migrants. Half the world's skilled migrants go to America, and in 20 years created 25% of all American venture-backed companies. Why? Well, Furman has this answer. The sort of people who migrate have a different pattern of motivation, abilities, and adjustment. They are hungrier, more risk-taking, and more hardy. You can think of it as the great sieve, the kind of thing that drives somebody to leave behind everything that's familiar to them, where everything is, well, stable and familiar. You know, they speak the language and the culture, and they have the manners, and they've got all their friends. They leave behind all of that to go to a place that is completely different, different language, different culture, different skills, potentially hostile to them. The kind of person that does that has the kind of nature that causes extraordinary diligence and change. When you look at the list of top entrepreneurship characteristics that Bill Zinke lists in Forbes magazine, almost all of these characteristics are the kinds of things that migration self-selects for. So countries that are open to migrants are also to migration are asking for opportunities for these kinds of people, and they are the ones that bringing great skills and talents with them. We find that 2/3 of all the people in the United States earning PhDs in engineering and in the sciences are from China and India. Well, the most are coming from India. And unfortunately, a lot of times they're told, well, okay, once you've graduated and gotten your degree, well, you have to leave because we're only going to allow a certain number of people. In fact, that cap of people who are allowed in for jobs in America is filled in the first couple days of the opening of the applications. It's a tragedy that the United States isn't more open to people. Ronald Bailey of Reason magazine says a worker in Somalia can produce only 1/10 the economic value of a worker in the United States. But as soon as she trades the hellhole of Mogadishu for the comparative paradise of Minneapolis, she can immediately produce vastly more. Multiply that by hundreds of millions still stuck in low productivity countries. I like to think of it with regard to my own wife. She traveled from China, where she grew up during the Cultural Revolution, and her skills and talents were greatly repressed, and she wasn't able to do much in the worst of conditions of China as it was when she was living there. But she came to the United States, and she was much more productive and skilled, and as a consequence, we're all better off, or at least I am. University of Wisconsin economist John Kennan says if all workers of the world were allowed to move to places with higher total factor productivity, it would produce the equivalent of doubling the world's supply of labor. And actually, I think it'd be far more than that. It could be many times the increase. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, you can't have migration as long as you got the welfare state. Well, I'd say don't stop the migration, stop the welfare state, because the welfare state is an unnecessary thing for Americans and for migrants. It's not useful at all. It takes money from productive and prosperous people to give it to people who are less productive, maybe not productive at all, and encourages the lack of productivity. If there's charity, it should be voluntary, and all the opportunities for growth, meaning jobs and opportunities, open up when you reduce the tax burden of the state for welfare. My own research shows that if the migrants were really coming for the welfare, well, once they're in the United States, they would go to the states that offer the most welfare. Every state has a different level of welfare, and they would offer the money to the states. The people would be moving in droves to the countries, the states that have the most welfare. But my evidence shows it's exactly the opposite. Both the native, the domestic migration and foreign-born migration is away from the states with the highest amounts of welfare and to the states with the least amount of welfare. Why? Because people don't come from other countries, by and large, for the welfare. They're coming for the opportunities. They're fleeing the tyranny and the oppression of and the poverty of the countries they're leaving, and coming for the freedom to produce and to become productive in the countries that allow it. So, as Tom Palmer mentioned in his previous talk, let them work. Instead of having all these rules saying, you know, protecting American labor, that you're not allowed to work in America because you might outcompete us. I had a student of mine, Sebastian from Germany. He was saying we have a saying in Germany: if you're afraid that a migrant who has no skills and has skills but he's coming from a long distance away, if you're afraid that he's going to take your job, the problem isn't with the migrant. The problem is with you. And frankly, it's bizarre. The people of the richest countries in the world don't feel that they can compete with the people of the poorest countries of the world, when in fact they should be competing. Now, a great thing that also Tom mentioned was the tremendous benefit of remittances. Remittances, that means the money that's given from migrants to the people back home, to the country they left, have soared in recent years. In recent years, they've tripled in the amount of money that's being sent back home, and this has tremendously benefited the countries in low-income countries, especially. I mean, it's gone up sixfold. The money that's gone from remittances going back to low-income countries, so much so that it's now 8% of the GDP in those countries. In a country like Nepal, it's the equivalent of 169% of all their imports. It's a tremendous value, and it's so much better than overseas development assistance or foreign aid, because foreign aid is money that's taken from poor people in rich countries and given to rich people in poor countries. It doesn't really go from people who value what they've produced to people who value what's being sent to them. But remittances do. The person who earns the money in a rich country knows what it took to produce it, and they send it to the people who they know can benefit by it, their family and their friends, who will make good use of that money much better than foreign aid. And I'm pleased to see that remittances are 3 times more than all the overseas development assistance combined. And they actually stack up pretty well against foreign direct investment. If you exclude the foreign direct investment in China alone, then you could say the remittances are nearly a third greater than all of the foreign direct investment around the world. And, well, of course, adding in China, it's not as much as the foreign direct investment in total, but it's still a very, very substantial thing. Probably has more to do with benefiting the development in other poor countries than any of the overseas foreign development assistance has been doing. Now, a lot of times people say, well, there's no space in America, and of course this is not true. All the cities and suburbs account for only about 3% of the land area in the United States. Government owns about a third of the land in the United States. There's a huge, vast amount of land out there to be utilized and to be homesteaded by people who should be allowed to come, just as the ancestors, the Americans who are here, did long ago, when the Europeans took the land from the Indians, and when and so on. It was not a nice thing that they conquered it from the Indians and took it away in the manner that they did. But a lot of use with the land was made productive by the homesteading that was allowed, and it should be allowed still again. As a matter of fact, there's more opportunity for cities and for open spaces. Consider that throughout history, people have been moving to cities. They move from the countryside into the cities because crowded cities is where the action is. That's where the productivity is. That's where the economies of scale, comparative advantage. All the greatest opportunities for networking and interconnection of productivity is made in cities. People move to cities for their own benefit, and that leaves more space in the countryside. In recent years, New York State and California have both been declining in population, but the cities within them, New York City and Los Angeles, have been increasing in population. So there's more crowds in the cities and more space in the countryside for whatever you want. And people have been seeking out that, and they're able to make tremendous benefit when they're simply allowed the freedom to make use of that land. Take, for example, Las Vegas. It was just a desert 100 years ago. There was nothing there. It was almost just a desert, but now it's blossomed into a very thriving and prosperous city. an oasis in the desert because of just simply allowing gambling there that wasn't allowed in other places. Now, a lot of people are very terrified of migrants coming because of, well, the terrorism. 9/11 was certainly a hate crime by 15 terrorists who brought terrible calamity to the United States. And terrorism occurs around the world. Just recently we've seen the examples of terrorism in Paris and France. And that is something that needs to be addressed. It can be addressed by addressing it in the same way we would address hate crimes in America. We have hate crimes across America, and we have hate groups, but we deal with them as individuals. We don't treat them as collectively, as if everyone from a certain region was a terrorist. For example, the biggest terrorist example in the United States on a per capita basis, where Timothy McVeigh bombed the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. He killed more people per capita than the 9/11 terrorists did on an individual basis. And you know, certainly a horrible person, a terrible person. And it came from New York. Now, that does not mean that we should treat this in a primitive collectivist manner and say that everybody from New York is a terrorist, and therefore we should put up walls around New York and prevent anyone from New York to go to anywhere else in the country. No, we treat this as an individual basis. We hold individuals accountable for their own behavior and not for the behavior of others. So it was, we need to be considering the tremendous benefit of refugees, not only to the practical benefit of having thousands upon thousands of very productive human beings adding to our productivity and wealth in a country, because they have not just mouths, but they have arms and legs and brains that can bring tremendous prosperity with them. But we also need to be thinking of the humane aspect. Not too long ago, still within memory of most people of many people in the world, is the horrors of the Holocaust in Germany. Everybody holds up Adolf Hitler as being a horrible, miserable demon of a human being. He killed millions upon millions of people. What is little known is the fact that many of those millions could have been saved simply by allowing them to migrate as refugees out of Germany and Central Europe and Eastern Europe to the West, where they could have been greeted by friends and family, embraced into the economic system. Courage could have made them part of the resistance against Hitler. But instead, the doors were closed, and by the millions, the Jews and other Europeans were slaughtered by Hitler because there was simply no place to allow them to go. What is little known about Anne Frank's family and her situation is that her father twice applied for a visa to the United States and was denied. So I go back to the point here of Julian Simon, the great economist, who says that the human being is the ultimate resource. The countries grow not in spite of having more people, but because they have more people who can produce wealth, goods, and services, just as the United States and England did with their populations growing over the centuries. The greatest growth came at a time when they had the greatest increase in their population. And I'd also say that the great thing about prosperity is that it reduces the fertility rate, so that people then can produce a great deal more of their wealth for their children, but they also can benefit by migrants to take care of them as their aging population goes. And ultimately, I'd say every country in the world has been seeking barrels of oil, and every country in the world has been seeking to shut out human beings. Well, I say that the human beings are far more valuable than the barrels of oil, and that we ought to respect that difference and allow the human beings to move around the planet and be productive entrepreneurs. So that ends my presentation. I'll go to what I'm sure are bound to be a lot of your questions about this time. I got an applause for my wife here. That's nice. Yeah.
Well, my microphone was still muted, or you would have heard me too. That was spectacular, and I wish we had more time because you had so many things on each slide, and each one of them could have deserved a longer conversation. I found myself really stricken by the image that you barely mentioned of that poor farmer who was literally crushed by the wheel I spoke of in my talk. I mean, literally physically crushed by those in power. And this is the real world. So this illustrates precisely what I was saying. It dovetails nicely. So I'm not sure I should really thank you because I'm probably going to have nightmares with that image in my head now.
My wife translated that the notation that came along with that photograph, and she said that the official policy in the countryside was you could allow as many as 3 people to be killed by the bulldozers before you could open up an investigation to see if there was a justification behind it. It was a tragic process in some of the provinces.
Wow, that's phenomenal. We did have a question about your provincial data. Did that come from the Fraser report or somewhere else?
That was from a contact that I had in the Fraser Institute. I forget his name. Actually, he was. I met him when I was down in South Africa, and he told me about it, and he sent me that data. And he was working with the Fraser Institute. Now, I haven't gotten updated information since I discussed with him about it. I don't know what they officially state, but anyway, that's it. Okay. That's what he said. Yeah.
Just a quick question about the source. We also had a question about whether the economic freedom mitigates the lack of political freedom. You mentioned places where there was higher prosperity as a result of economic freedom, but they're not politically all that free. Does the one offset the other? Is one more important than the other? Or what do you think?
Well, I think that the economic freedom often precedes political freedom. Of course, I champion all kinds of political freedom, but I recognize that in countries that have neither, that economic freedom, if it comes first, enables people to then pursue the political freedom. I think that that's what's happening in China, for example, on a widespread scale. But you find, just a year ago, I was in Hong Kong when they had the occupation movement and protest about the Chinese government's continued control over Hong Kong. And, they're frustrated with it, but they lead a very, very prosperous life compared to anyone else in China. They have not anyone else, but they have a very prosperous life with lots of opportunity, and they have freedom of speech in Hong Kong, even though they can't select a ruler. But I don't think that selecting the ruler is the ultimate measure of freedom. If rulers are leaving you alone, then who selects that benign ruler is less important than what they do with that power.
Personally, I felt sort of touched by your point about your wife being an immigrant. My wife is an immigrant. Ultimately, all Americans are immigrants, and the idea of somehow older immigrants are better than newer immigrants, it's just crazy. But I happened to be on an airplane recently, and I met a young lady from Cuba who was going to meet her boyfriend. He was one of those people who built a raft and sailed himself across the shark-infested waters, made it to Florida, got a job, worked his posterior off, saved up money, sent it to her, so she got herself into the United States. And I was on an airplane sitting next to this woman. Somebody had given her a smartphone. She didn't know how to use it. She didn't know how to turn on the Wi-Fi. It was like somebody out of the dark ages. She had no idea. And she says, in Cuba, we have nothing. Yeah. What do you want to do? She doesn't know. But she wants to do something. She's not here for the welfare. She wasn't looking for a check. Her boyfriend certainly wasn't. He worked, and she wanted to do something. Anything, didn't matter. If she was interested in fashion or hair, hair design or whatever, something. She wanted to do something. So it's just amazing to me that people have these attitudes. And by the way, when we got to the airport, I just happened to be behind her when she came out of the so-called secure zone. The boy was there. He had a big bouquet of flowers. It was very romantic.
Wow, what a great moving moment that must have been, yeah, for you.
So, interesting link between entrepreneurship and immigration. And but help me out with the context a little bit. The number was something like 25% of which people were entrepreneurs. I mean, if 25, there was a slide where you had like 25%.
25% of venture-backed companies, public venture-backed companies, between 2006 and 2012 were started by immigrants.
And those were first-generation immigrants. They came from somewhere else, or their parents came from somewhere.
That's right.
So,
it seems that second-generation migrants may lose out in some of the entrepreneurial ideas, but they soar in the school, performance and exams. Second generation do much better from Asia and all over the world, than the average American student in school.
okay, so to make sure we're comparing apples to apples, if 25% of first-generation migrants are responsible for this level of venture capitalism, what is the percentage of the U.S. population that is first-generation migrants? I mean, I assume it's much smaller than 25%, and therefore 25% is a lot. But do you know? I mean, it must. We don't let that many people in, so it can't be a very large percentage.
That's a good question. No, I don't know that information offhand, but there was a very extensive report produced by Stuart Anderson, which I found online, and he's also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, so his work should be available online, and I would refer them to that. So look for the report, which was called, let's see.
Send me a link. I'll post it to one of the discussion groups if you send me a link. The reason why I asked, though, is if 25% were by first-generation migrants, well, 75% were not by first-generation migrants. But obviously, the percentage of the overall population of first-generation migrants must be much smaller than 25%, which means proportionally they're contributing a lot to entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
For the reasons, the psychology that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think. I mean, you think, when you mention these people going across shark-infested waters, going from Cuba to Florida, I've heard that it's as much as 25% don't make it. That's exposure, that's storms, it's sharks, it's pirates, it's just a rickety boat that sinks, and so what extraordinary courage it takes for somebody to do that, to risk that. And I'm not sure that I would do it. I mean, I would have to be facing some real horrendous circumstance to be willing to take that risk myself. And then to think that it's that kind of personality that takes those risks, then lands ashore when they look around and everywhere they see opportunities. And you look at I go down to Fort Street Mall in downtown, I see all these homeless people who are sitting around and doing nothing with their lives, and a lot of them, just claiming that they don't have any opportunities, there's no jobs and everything. But a migrant who comes off a ship like that or a boat like that and looks around, he sees nothing but opportunities everywhere, if they're allowed to work. And that's another barrier too. A lot of people, they want to be following the rules, but then it makes life difficult in this land of opportunity.
We must have papers. Where are your papers?
yeah, right.
We have a request for you to share your slideshow. There was such a wealth of information, so perhaps if you could email it to us, or if it's available somewhere on the web, we could post a link to it later.
I'll be happy to. I did give a talk, a similar talk at the Bali conference, and that is posted on the ISIL website, my presentation. But I'll be very happy to send you I mean, it's a big file. I tend to be old school, and I tend to just add pictures to and I prefer pictures to words on PowerPoint, but it makes a very, very big file. So I'll send it to you by WeTransfer, and then you can figure out what the best way is distributing.
Go ahead and send the link too, and we'll start with that, and then we'll see if there's a place we can host a larger file. Because the viewer is right. I mean, there's such a wealth of information there.
Great. More than happy to. Yeah, great.
Okay. All right. Well, we need to clear the airwaves here to make way for the next speaker. Let me just give us one more second in case we get one last-minute message or question here. I'm not seeing any questions. So, Ken Schoolland, thank you so much, Professor Fun, for joining us today. Wasn't the most fun talk ever, some pretty grim realities in there, but also a very upbeat message. I appreciated it, very thought-provoking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lobo. What you're doing here is fabulous, and I'm looking forward to doing it again. And actually, I'm looking forward to hearing all of your speakers. I really enjoyed your talk about the Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and how it weaves into life this morning. That was right on. Yeah,
thank you very much. All right, have a good day, my friend.
Aloha.
Bye.